Our next speaker has a unique breadth of knowledge on how businesses are embedding sustainability through their work with their clients and their own upskilling. Please join me in welcoming Paul Knopp, who's the Chair and Chief Executive Officer of KPMG, and he's going to be in conversation with Gillian Tett, who you met earlier on our panel from the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Can everyone who's going to sit down quickly take your seats so that we can continue as smoothly as possible, because it's a real pleasure and an honour to have a chance to speak to Paul Knopp. He's somebody who, as you see, is Chair and CEO of KPMG in America. He has spent many years with the group, worked a lot on the audit side in particular. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Proud Texan, which is a wonderful perspective to have in the room in this progressive bastion right now, and is thus very well placed to address a question which I'd like to kick off with first of all, which is this. So you at KPMG offer a wide range of different services. You haven't yet split yourself up or threatened to do so, although I'd love to ask you if you have any views on the merits of that. But you're doing everything from regulatory advice, reporting, to audit, to strategy, to business development for your clients. When you look at your clients in America, what proportion of those do you think want ESG advice today? And how would that have changed compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
Gillian, I'm pleased to be here, and thanks everybody for having me today. And although I was born in Texas and lived in Texas for a long time, I've also lived in Chicago for 12 years, in St. Louis, and New York, and Connecticut, and Virginia. So I've been around many different states.
So you're proudly purple, we can say.
My friends in Texas know I became a Cubs fan when I lived in Chicago. So I know. But anyway, I'm not trying to avoid the question. So the question's really important, and you know, I will give you maybe a paraphrase, as close to a quote of something I heard at Davos that I believe to be absolutely true, and that is that you will see business leaders in the United States and across the world making commitments. And we've made our own DEI and climate commitments at KPMG. And we also know that over the course of the last 3 years, if you look at measures like the Edelman Trust Index, you see that businesses are the most trusted institutions today. And we want to remain the most trusted institutions. And so for that reason, we need to fulfill our commitments. And I will say that the vast majority of all of our clients, very high percentage, have made climate commitments. Probably less have made public DEI commitments, but many have. And the conversation we're having with companies absolutely illustrates that they are serious about those commitments. And so what I will tell you is that in boardrooms, in the C-suite, we're having a lot of conversations today about trying to ensure that it's not just a compliance exercise, to ensure that you are getting to your net zero commitments, you're getting to your DI commitments, that it's actually a transformational commitment. So I think in that regard, the business community is somewhat progressive in how they're thinking about their role in driving really important change to cause more sustainability around both the climate and around the DEI commitments we're making.
That's fascinating. I mean, I spoke earlier this morning about the new phenomena of what we call at the Financial Times green hushing, not green washing, but green hushing, in the sense that, you know, a lot of the companies we speak to are doing a lot of stuff in this area, but just not wanting to talk about it today, unlike 2 or 3 years ago. Is that what you're seeing too? And to what degree, since you do live in Texas, do you think that you're actually seeing a real backlash against ESG that's impacting boards and causing them to either be quiet about what they're doing or simply stop what they're doing?
Sure. I also have an apartment in New York City, by the way. I love New York City. One of my favorite places in the world.
I think that's called hedging your bets.
Yes. I love being here. So, but I do spend most of my weekends in Texas. You're correct. So I think, there were some headwinds before Russia invaded Ukraine, but when Russia invaded Ukraine and energy security became top of mind for so many, those headwinds increased in intensity. So I think what you're seeing, no doubt, is some of those headwinds and the impacts of some of those headwinds on companies in terms of how much they might say about this topic. But despite that fact, the commitments, we have not seen companies change their commitments. And we continue to see with almost every company we work with, companies trying to embed in their strategies how they get to those commitments at the end of the day. Because as you know, when it comes to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and climate commitments in particular, and some of those headwinds aren't just climate, some of them are also in the social category, we see companies trying to determine how they truly do transform their organizations to become net zero by the date they've established. And of course, there's various different dates for various different companies. In our case at KPMG, it's 2030, and we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% to get there. Also, though, we know that we're going to have to transform and to some degree use some carbon credits. I mean, that's a reality too. So, there is no doubt in some states in the U.S. challenges when it comes to how much you say, but I haven't seen companies backing off those commitments, whether they're in the state of Texas or they're in the state of any state in the union.
Well, that's really fascinating, I must say, because it certainly matches what we see, but I would expect your clients to be slightly more honest and upfront with you than they are with us. So that's what you get paid for.
Just one other thing, too. Also, surveys would indicate this, too. When we did a survey late last year that indicated that from 2021 to 2022, 70% of the CEOs said that their ESG efforts were improving their financial performance. And it jumped from 36% to 70% in 1 year. So there's also recognition that the efforts around climate in particular can help improve financial performance.
That's fascinating. It's certainly not a message or a factoid that's got out to the people campaigning against the DOL rule. That's really fascinating. In terms of audit, you do have a very long, very distinguished audit background. Don't look nervous. I'm not going to ask you yet about Silicon Valley Bank, though I will ask you about that in a minute. So don't leave the room, guys. But in terms of audit, let's turn to green audit and the whole issue about the horrific alphabet soup that we're all confronted with. How realistic do you think it is for the International Accounting Standard, sorry, I even forget what it's called, not SASB, the ISSB.
Yes.
Yeah, it's what I call the ISB and the G fans, which are like Korean boy bands. How realistic is it to actually have the ISB deliver a set of metrics? I mean, they tell me they're going to try and put them out by the summer. They're going to try and have people adopt them next year. In your view, is that complete fantasy?
No, it is not. So I was actually interviewed at the University of Texas at Austin 2 weeks ago at the Climate Cap Summit, and the
University of Austin had a Climate Cap Summit. Fantastic. That's great. I mean, that really is good.
The person that interviewed me was actually Dr. Jeff Hales. He's on the ISSB.
Right.
And what I'll tell you is that businesses are very concerned about this subject. So they want comparability, they want consistency, they want to be able to be measured the same way against their competitors and others. And what the ISSB is doing with respect to the standards they're putting out this year and then in final promulgated form early next year is they're establishing a global baseline for standards. And what we have been pushing at KPMG, and if you look at our comment letter to the SEC, we have said that we support a building blocks approach. So in other words, the ISSB will have standards in certain geographies and regions of the world. They might want you to use what they call GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. They might want you to use European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the SRS. But the reality is that those things can be used in conjunction with each other to provide great reporting around ESG metrics. The problem is, as you've alluded to, is that without one harmonized global set of standards, it's not going to lead to the kind of consistency that we need. And I think there is certainly cooperation, collaboration happening right now amongst those standard setters to try to get to something that's closer to harmony. There really is a huge impetus for it in the form of the European Union's corporate sustainability reporting directive. I often just call it CSRD, so I tried to say the acronym out, and I screwed it up. Sorry about that. The CSRD, the EU reporting on ESG metrics is here. It's here to stay. It's already been promulgated, and we need more collaboration amongst the ISSB, the GRI, and others to try to get to harmony. But I think that the ISSB's establishing a baseline is a huge step in the right direction.
And do you think that the only way to establish that baseline is basically going to be to jettison Scope 3? Because certainly we were both in Davos. The vast majority of people I spoke to there essentially said Scope 3 is just going to be unworkable for the foreseeable future. It will have to go. And certainly the overwhelming expectation in Washington right now is that whatever happens to the SEC proposals, Scope 3 will have to be taken out.
So the standard setters will not jettison Scope 3. They are writing standards. They have standards that address Scope 3. It's where we have to be aware of what's happening is the regulators and the legislative body. So in particular, the EU with CSRD, they have required Scope 3 disclosures. There are, if you look at the comments the SEC got on their rulemaking, which is not final yet and could be final in the next 3 months, there's a lot of commentary on materiality, on Scope 3, and there's also a lot of commentary on, do you even have the authority to tell us we have to do this? That's the main subjects. And maybe the last one, should it really have to be attested to? Now on Scope 3, what we have to watch for is whether or not the regulators will require reporting on it. We've seen Chairman Gensler's comments around this, where he has acknowledged that, yes, there's a level of complexity with Scope 3 that we have to be cognizant of. But that does not mean that over time Scope 3 won't be subject to reporting, and potentially down the road in the U.S. attestation, we'll see. But in the EU, it's a reality. There will be attestation around certain Scope 3 metrics over time.
Are you seeing a lot of your clients becoming increasingly nervous about the legal liabilities they may face because of these shifts?
Well, so anytime that you're reporting on anything in a document that has a legal foundation, you're going to be somewhat concerned about liability. So what I mean by that is often these ESG metrics are contained in the same document that contains your financial statements. And over time, we expect the level of scrutiny that will be given to these metrics will be closing in on the same level of scrutiny that they'll have on financial metrics. So there is no doubt that companies are concerned with getting it right. What I'll share with you, Gillian, is that when I speak to companies and I speak to clients, one of their biggest concerns is having the right quality of data and capturing the right data and having the right governance around the data, the right controls around the data. Those are huge topics for organizations right now that they're really hard at work on.
Well, that's really fascinating, because I wanted to ask you, in fact, you foreshadowed my next question about the quality of data and what you're advising your clients. I'm curious about that, about what companies can or cannot do about that. I'm also really curious about people, because I know you've worked with NYU Stern for training courses and things like that. To what degree do you think there's a real shortage of green talent in this world? I was over in England at a business school last year who told me that when they had an audit course in their business school, all the students who had to turn up turned up. When they slapped the word green on it, green audit, the numbers immediately trebled. I'm curious though, in spite of that kind of shift in business schools, are you seeing enough people in your company who can actually deal with this stuff properly, or in your clients?
There is no doubt that we need more talent to address the transformation and the transition that needs to happen when it comes to the actual work of trying to get to more carbon neutrality or net zero. And the same holds true with principles of around the S and the G. So it's not only the major firms like KPMG and the other big four and a lot of consulting organizations that need more talent. It's organizations across the board. Now, some of that talent is just going to come naturally from the areas of expertise in schools like engineering schools, that climatology, that will help us bolster that set of resources. I can tell you, you're right, that there's no doubt that ESG is attracting talent in colleges today. That's a great sign, but I think we all need more talent in this space.
Yeah, I often tell students when I meet them that if you want to go into a field that will get you a job in the future, almost no matter what, green audit is one of them, because there's going to be a bottomless pit of that.
I told all my kids it's not working currently, the same thing.
Yeah, well, that's the peril of being a parent. There's a question I have to ask you about Silicon Valley Bank at Signature, because obviously it's top of the news right now, and I am a journalist. What on earth went wrong? I mean, in the sense of you guys gave them a clean bill of health from an audit perspective about 5 minutes ago, or 5 minutes before they collapsed. What on earth went wrong?
Well, that's a very broad question. And so,
I'm sure you've had years of media training to prepare you for that kind of thing.
Yes. Well, actually, I was an auditor for 36 and a half years before I became CEO. I went straight from auditing companies to the C-suite. So I did nothing for 36 and a half years before I became CEO, but audit companies. So it's a passion, obviously, but actually running KPMG now is my passion. So let me just start with something that won't surprise you, and that is that we do have in our professional standards a client confidentiality obligation. So I can't speak specifically about the work we did to audit and what we did to audit those two institutions. What I will tell you is that as we reflect on this today and we take into account everything that we know today, that we stand behind the report we issued, and that we think we followed all professional standards. And one thing that is true of an audit is you have a responsibility until the day you issue the audit report to consider all facts that you know. So we absolutely did do that. But what you can't know with certainty is what might happen after that audit report is issued. And in particular, when there are events that happen that are market-driven, that are based on events and actions that management might take, and then there are customers or other stakeholders that might react in a way that's very unpredictable to what has happened. And so this is a very complex situation, and there certainly is a situation here where there were actions taken in the month of March that set off another set of reactions that led to those two institutions being closed.
Right. I mean, coming back to the ESG issue and linking them together.
Gladly.
I'm sure. Actually, just very quickly on that point, did you guys not notice that the losses, unrealized losses on the bond portfolio could wipe out Tier 1 capital? That seems like quite an important detail.
So, yes, but there's a lot more to it than that in terms of the accounting for those securities and how you know or how you evaluate how long they may be held. So It's much more complicated than just what is the unrealized losses at one point in time.
Right. Well, on the ESG issue, the Wall Street Journal came out with a basic editorial, which you might have seen, essentially saying something along the lines of, we're not saying that if SVP had had a board of 12 middle-aged white male, it would have been different, but do you think, given the Wall Street Journal's editorial and the views expressed by a number of people in the anti-ESG camp, do you think that a focus on D&I, ESG, issues like that have distracted your clients from some of their core business challenges and core elements of risk management?
So I'll answer the last question you asked first. I don't see evidence of that. And I have not seen that editorial, but I heard about it a short while ago and read something about it earlier today without having read the...
That's the definition of a newspaper story that's gone viral, when everyone knows about it but hasn't read it.
Yeah. So, I'll just put it in terms of how I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I came into this job on July 1st, 2020, 36 days after George Floyd was murdered. And we realized at KPMG that we had not done enough to really transform and strategically embed in the organization the DEI efforts that need to be undertaken to make sure that we're more diverse ourselves. And I think that when it comes to boardrooms, when it comes to C-suites, we have to be a heck of a lot more intentional about driving diversity. I'll give you an example. KPMG has a partnership in the U.S. with 2,400 partners. Only 23% of those partners are women. But I have a 10-person management committee. I made sure that 5 out of the 10 partners on the management committee were women. Today, 1 is black. Before, 1 woman left to go to a big client. There 2 are black out of the 10. 1's a Latina woman. And I feel really great about the fact that we are signaling to the organization that we absolutely are ensuring that we're being intentional about putting diverse talent at the top of the organization to set the tone for the rest of the organization, that we have to be more diverse and inclusive. It's an imperative. And I know we only have 30 minutes today. I could speak forever on this topic, but to me, it's crucially important that in the United States in particular, that we are much more intentional about driving diversity from the boardroom to the manufacturing floor.
Right, that's fascinating. I'm going to go for questions in just 1 second. One other very quick question I'd like to ask is, did you ever dream that you would end up in this role crusading for social and environmental issues? Because you started life as an auditor. When I was at college, the people who wanted to become accountants, for the most part, were pretty focused on the bottom line. And people like me who are anthropologists were sort of hippy-dippy and floating around. And a lot of them were essentially, involved in campaigns on environmental and social causes. And I always naively assumed that it would be the tie-dye wearing campaign activist anthropologists who changed the world, not the accountants. But the reality is that kind of what you're doing is sort of almost like warrior accounting. You are going forth and, collectively as a group, promoting change by promoting change in how people count things. Did you ever imagine that would happen?
No, I graduated, I'm very old. I graduated from college in 1983, so I did not imagine it, but I couldn't be more pumped up and more energized by the work we're doing to try to help ensure that our world is more sustainable when it comes to climate, and certainly when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm really excited about the work that we're doing in particular.
Wow. I say to people, if you want to go and change the world, don't just go and hug a tree, count a tree. But, any questions? And a question there. This could be one of your future wannabe employees here.
Hi, my name is Neha. I'm an NYU Stern MBA student. I'm actually also an EY employee, so maybe competitor instead.
All the big 4 are fantastic.
But I'm not on the audit side, I'm on the consulting side. So first of all, I want to shout you out for what you shared about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Women in leadership, especially in consulting and Big 4, is definitely a trend that needs to continue. My question for you is about the role of consultancies in the ESG movement. One of the challenges I see for our industry is that we are sometimes very limited by our statement of work. We can only do the work that clients have invited us in and paid us to do. So what is your perspective on our role and responsibility in fighting for this wave of change, and how might we be more influential as an industry?
What a brilliant question.
Yeah, so it is a great question, and you're right about that. But one thing that we've always done in the business, and the model the Big 4 has of consulting, audit, tax is such a powerful model, is that despite the fact we may have a statement of work and a scope of work, we've always been able to say, hey, while we were doing that work, we happened to made an observation that comes with a recommendation, and we'd like you to consider the observation and the recommendation. Now, the client may not take that anywhere, quite frankly, but it's one of the powers of our business model that we can do that. And I think, as you know, most clients are pretty open to that conversation about what we observed and how they can improve. So I think that's what's really interesting about our model, and it's true of all three of our businesses.
Great. I should ask the organisers, do we have time for any more questions? One more. One, okay. Let's get over here. If you sit in the front row, you get rewarded.
Hi. So my question sort of goes back to the disclosure about ESG information and the anti-ESG movement. Mm-hmm. How can companies manage the dichotomy between the EU, potentially the SEC, and everyone else wanting more information, and then particularly for asset managers, for example, the demands from red states to not consider these factors? Like, how can companies determine what they should and shouldn't disclose? And is there risk that by complying with some of these regulations, they might be sort of penalized by these red states' regulations?
Oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say that's another great question.
It is. So we have to be aware of the laws that some states put in. You're right. There's a fact, too, that we have to all comply with the law with respect to the ESG disclosures and metrics. So, for instance, you can be a U.S.-based company with material EU operations, and you will have to follow the CSRD in terms of what's required of you. And so, you absolutely have to follow laws and regulations. And you need, try to be influential where you can. But I don't, if you look at the majority of the U.S., I don't think that the laws and regulations of any particular state right now are slowing companies down from their reporting. As a matter of fact, some companies in the U.S., even without an obligation to report, there's a fair number, are reporting today. And if you look at the 250 biggest companies in the world, 96% are reporting some form of sustainability metrics. So, and then some are even voluntarily having them certified at the same time, not necessarily for public information, but for their own board to know that the metrics are reliable and accurate. So I think it's going to be a balance that's hard to predict in the future, because you have to try to interpret and evaluate each one of those laws that comes from one of those states and try to determine how it impacts you and to ensure that you don't break a law. But certainly, as a general rule, the momentum behind reporting of sustainability metrics, the momentum is incredibly strong.
That's absolutely fascinating. Just to double check there, so you don't think that the state level rules that have been introduced in places like Florida or Texas are slowing down companies' reporting on ESG metrics?
So I don't have any evidence to suggest it is or it is not. What I would say is I don't believe it's really slowing down in any material way the efforts to transform. So there's the efforts to transform to become net zero. There's the efforts to become more diverse and inclusive and equitable. I'm thinking more about the efforts that I see in the world, including energy companies, to try to transform what they're doing. And we have to remember, part of the momentum behind all this is that, and the last panel talked about this, is that our employees, and when I say our, I'm not just talking about KPMG, I'm talking about many companies, they want us to be more diverse and inclusive, they want us to be more equitable, they want us to be more climate friendly. Our customers want us to be that way too. So we have many stakeholders that are telling us, if you don't become more equitable or diverse, if you don't become more, if you don't reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to do business with somebody else. And that's true of companies across the board. They are hearing from their stakeholders that they need to be greener, they need to be more diverse. And that's tremendous momentum that I have not seen subside, even in the last year.
Well, that's fantastic. It's a striking sign of the power of stakeholder democracy, even if the political variant sometimes wobbles. So thank you very much indeed for a really interesting conversation, and best of luck in navigating all these competing trends going forward. I imagine you're going to have a busy week, so thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.